Well, thank you again. So, Paul, I think we first met when you were doing a PGCE in Cambridge, and I was a student there. And Paul was well known for going round. Back in the days before the internet, you used to have cassette tapes of talks, and Paul would go around trying to distribute tapes of Martin Lloyd-Jones and John Piper. Have you listened to this talk? It's talk by Piper. You've got to listen to this. And it's wonderful to see all these years later that just as John Piper had 4 sons and an adopted daughter, Jumpy has managed to follow suit in exactly the same way. Many of us who've been following Jumpy over these years have been very pleased to see this. Praise the Lord. So, Genesis chapter 15, if you'd like to turn back to that. Last night we began to see God's plan to save the world through a family, a flawed family. And in the chapters that follow we continue to see a mixture of flaws and faithfulness from Abraham and his nephew Lot in chapters 13 and 14. Lot makes some poor choices that will have disastrous consequences. We'll see that later this morning. And Abraham has learnt something from this test of famine at chapter 12. And by the end of chapter 14, he's secured an extraordinary victory with just 318 men against the mighty king Kedorlaomer and his allies. And he's demonstrated great faithfulness in his dealings with the king of Sodom at the end of chapter 14, who wants to kind of buy him and kind of make a treaty with him. And Abram says, no, I'm not doing that. I'm going to stay faithful to the God who has called me. So he says no. But then chapter 15 begins with a crisis of confidence. So verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abraham in a vision. Fear not, Abraham, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. Faith often gives way very quickly to fear, doesn't it? Things may have been going well, but maybe too well. Maybe something bad is about to happen. How will I cope if the news at work or at the hospital is not good? And God here, for Abraham, as he fears, is speaking words of reassurance. Abraham comes back. You speak of this reward that's going to be very great, Lord. But look, these promises that you've made are basically about me being the father of a great nation. But Sarai and I are very old, and she's been labelled. Do you remember she was labelled barren? The first thing we knew about her back in chapter 11, even before God made these promises. She has been unable to have children. And right now, he's saying, verse 2, Eliezer of Damascus stands to inherit the estate. We don't know who this guy was. Verse 3 suggests maybe he's some kind of servant in Abraham's household. Well, surely he can't be the heir, the one through whom God will fulfill his promises. So the question on Abraham's mind is, can he really trust God to keep these extraordinary promises? And it's not a completely ridiculous question, is it? For many Christians, their experience is that the longer they live and the more they go on as a Christian, actually the more they despair at sin and failure in themselves and others. I don't know if that's been your experience if you've been a Christian for a while. When they started out as a Christian, it wasn't actually all that hard to believe that God loved them. It was a wonderful thing to have discovered and to believe in the face of sin. But sometime later, actually, doubt has begun to set in. And we look back on a day or on a week, and we think, that was so selfish, the way that I behaved, the way that I spoke to my children or my spouse or my housemates. I was gutless in that conversation with my colleague when I really could easily have brought my Christian faith into what we were talking about, but I chose to stay silent. And then there are those intruding thoughts and attitudes that I'm pretty sure no one else knows about, but God knows about them. I call myself a Christian. How can I do that? Can God really forgive me? Can he use me? Does he really want someone like me in his kingdom? Does he actually love me? Will he keep his promises? And more than that, can we really believe in this kind of thing in the 21st century? You know, that Jesus is the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. You know, it's also exclusive in a pluralist world. And Jesus, the idea of Jesus coming back and God judging the world and bringing new heavens and new earth, it seems so unscientific to believe something like that. Well, in these verses, in chapter 15, we begin to see an answer to those questions. We start to see how and why we can be confident, even today, that God will keep these extraordinary promises that he's made. And the reason is that God doesn't just tell us that he's going to keep his promises. He doesn't just say, this is what I'm going to do, and you just need to believe it. He does much more than that. And we're going to see that now. So you've got a couple of headings there in the booklet. First, our fearful weakness cannot stop God from keeping his promises. Verses 1 to 6. Our fearful weakness cannot stop God from keeping his promises. We've seen Abraham's struggle, his doubt, in verses 1 to 3. Well, how then does God respond? He repeats and he further spells out his promise. Through chapters 12 to 14, God has been repeating the promise at various points. And if you go and read that, you'll see he restates it at various stages. And he gets more and more specific each time about the land and who will inherit it. But now it's clear it's not just a relative or a servant from his household. It's a son from Abraham's own body. And, you know, that, frankly, is ridiculous, Abraham's thinking. I mean, who could bring about the birth of a child to an old barren woman and her husband? I talked last night about the chances of me getting on Strictly Come Dancing. And it's like, you know, this is like, you know, further from what someone might have said to me, we were thinking last night, you know, Tom, not only will you appear on Strictly Come Dancing, not only will you win it, not only will you do that with a perfect 40 from the judges, but you will finish your final routine by leaping in the air and landing in the splits position. Well, let me tell you, my body does not do that. And Abraham just can't believe this, you see. His and Sarai's bodies are well past this being possible. And so God takes him outside. And he says, verse 5, look towards heaven and number the stars if you're able to number them. Now, in London, we can't really do this. I don't know whether you probably can't do it in Manchester either. Did anyone go outside last night and look up in the sky? Were there any stars to be seen? Was it cloudy? It was probably cloudy, wasn't it? But if you go to one of those places, you know, miles away from civilization, in pitch darkness, and you look up in the sky on a clear night, and you see, wow, what is out there? Millions and millions of stars. So shall your offspring be, he says, verse 5. Are you for real? Abraham might have said. Well, you know, what a crazy thing to say. You know, and it's easy to read verse 5 as if God is just repeating what he said in verse 4, but bigger. So, you know, he said, you're going to have a child, and the response is, well, don't be ridiculous. So he says, in a bigger way, you're going to have millions of children, like the stars. But actually, this isn't quite that. This isn't just reasserting a crazy promise. Like if I said to you, I'm going to give you a house. And you say, well, really? You're going to give me a house? And I'll say, yeah, I'm going to give you a house. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you to the Bishop's Avenue, which is like kind of Alderley Edge or Altrincham, but it's near Hampstead. And it's where a house was put on the market 8 years ago for £100 million. They had to make do in the end by selling it for a mere 25 million because no one wanted to buy it, unfortunately. Poor them. But imagine I take you to this extraordinary road that you can drive down, just see these extraordinary mansions, mansion after mansion. And I say to you, I'm going to give you one of those massive mansions with a porch with the biggest fake Greek columns you've ever seen. And you say, come on, Thomas, totally ridiculous. And of course, it is totally ridiculous unless It turns out I actually own the entire street and all the houses. Well, I don't, just to be clear. But, do you see, it makes all the difference when God tells you to look at the stars and count them. Because he made the stars. He does actually know how many stars there are. And he knows how old they are. And he knows the chemical formulae of all their gases. He made them. So this isn't just God sort of thinking, here's a metaphor for how many children you might have. This is a demonstration of his power to do what he says he can do. Do you see? Abraham, you're going to have a child. Don't be ridiculous. Sarah's barren. This is never going to happen. You're talking to the God who made the universe. Have you seen how many stars there are in the sky? Have you seen how big this universe is? He is the one who's making this promise to you. So if he says, so shall your offspring be, if he says you, old man Abraham and old woman Sarah, you are going to have a baby, you can believe it. Do you see? If he says you who struggle to believe, you who struggle to live consistently as a Christian, you who fear as much as you have faith, you whose faith is weak, not strong, if he says you are included in my promises too, you can believe it. So Abraham did. He believed the Lord, and verse 6, he counted it to him as righteousness. Some of the translations say he credited it to him as righteousness. This verse is where Paul goes in the New Testament to show that what we call justification by faith is not a new thing after Jesus has come. Justification means being declared right with God despite the fact that you're a sinner. And God looks at you and says, no, you are right with me. And the claim, as the Apostle Paul is going around preaching this, people are saying, oh, Paul, where'd you get this from? This is an entirely new thing. We've never heard this before. Saying, no, it's there. It's always been the way God has related to his people. So, and that is verse 6, what we read here says that this is what happened to Abraham. Flawed Abraham with all his sins and mistakes and fear and weakness. He believes what God says. He trusts him. And God says, you are right with me. And this gets us to the heart of the way that God consistently relates to his people throughout the Bible. You see, being right with him is not earned by merit, but is given as a gift and is received by faith. Righteousness is credited to Abraham, which means it's not intrinsically true of him because he's not acted in a right way. It's not that God is saying, oh, I'm going to pretend those things didn't happen in one sense. No, we know they did happen, and we know that he has not earned God's favour. And so if there was a sort of courtroom situation, well, no, you'd be found guilty for what you have done. But then, despite that, God looks at him and acts towards him and says, no, because you have believed my promises, you are in the right. I declare you right with me despite your sin. And so we heard that, and that's what that argument in the second half of Romans chapter 4, which is quite a sort of dense argument to sort of jump into like that. But that is what that bit of Romans chapter 4 is talking about. And so it gets summed up in Romans 4 verse 23. Paul says, the words it was credited to him, or it was counted to him, were written not for him alone, not for Abraham alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness, for us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. The 18th century preacher Charles Simeon called this the hinge upon which the whole of Christianity turns. And it's the beginning of the answer to our question about the sense how God can possibly love us unconditionally. How he can we really believe and trust him on that? Well, yes, we can, because he counts us righteous when we are not. He gives us the gift of being right with him. He imputes it to us, we sometimes call it. So that when he looks at us, he doesn't see our sin that we have done, but he sees the perfect life that Jesus lived. And you might say, well, hang on a minute, but it's not actually unconditional, is it? Because you have to believe. But the key thing to understand is that believing God's promises doesn't mean that we merit forgiveness because we are believing. God didn't credit righteousness to Abraham because his faith merited it, but this is simply the means by which we receive what God offers us. It's an empty hand. It's not a hand full of deeds done and merits earned. So let me give you an illustration to help us understand this. It's like if you're drowning in the middle of the ocean. You know, the ship has sunk, and there you are in the middle of the ocean, and all hope is lost. And you're desperately trying to keep afloat, but there's nobody to be seen for miles around and nothing to hold on to, and you are going to go under, and you know it. There's only a limited time before it's all over. But then the rescue helicopter turns up. And they winch down a guy with a life ring to rescue you. And all you have to do is put up your hand. And he will grab you and pull you out of the ocean to safety. Now at the press conference afterwards, as they tell the story of this amazing rescue that's happened, where's the focus in this press conference? Is it on you with your empty hands? You know, well guys, really, if it hadn't been for me reaching up, the rescuer wouldn't have been able to grab hold of me. Well done me. Well no, that's ridiculous, isn't it? See, the focus is entirely on the helicopter. They found you in the ocean, all that miles and miles and miles, and they found you. And they came down and they got you out and they rescued you. Well done. And so they're the ones who get the medals and the applause. And your empty hand, do you see, as you reach up, is just the way that you receive what he offers. That is faith. Do you see? That is how Abraham was counted right with God when he wasn't. See, there was nothing, Abraham's sitting there thinking, there was nothing I can do in this situation. Me with my old body and my barren wife. This is never going to happen, but God says it's going to happen. And he's the one who made the stars, so I trust him. And so his faith is credited to him, counted to him as righteousness. Well, it's the same for us, do you see? So the question then for us is, well, have you trusted in God's promises like Abraham? It's not something we do automatically. We're not born trusting in God. We need to understand that we are weak and fearful, and we have nothing to offer God to earn his forgiveness. We have turned our backs on him. There's nothing here for God to work with in and of ourselves, but he offers to count us right with him when we're not. And so he says to each one of us, believe what he offers and trust him. Now, I don't know whether you've done that. You could do that today even. But it does raise a further question. How can this be right? You see, how can God be right when he says we're right when we're wrong? I mean, how can that really be fair? Think of that sort of courtroom scene idea. You've been found guilty. You are guilty of the crimes. And then the judge is saying you're not guilty and declaring you right. And you think, that's amazing. It's brilliant. But is it fair? Is it just? If that happened on a court case and it was reported in the news, everyone would say, what a travesty. How can a judge behave like that? And that takes us to the second half of the passage that we need to see. Our covenant-breaking sin cannot stop God from keeping his promises. Our covenant-breaking sin cannot stop God from keeping his promises, from verse 7 onwards. And what happens next is a very similar pattern to the first 6 verses. There's a statement from God, a restatement of his promise of the land. Then a question from Abraham. How can I know this for sure? And then a sign and a promise follow. The other way around from verses 1 to 6, but the same idea. So the sign before was look at the stars. Now what's he going to do? The sign this time takes the form of a covenant. Now covenants are really important in the Bible, but they're often kind of ignored and we don't notice them. But the point of a covenant is to be a solemn promise between two parties which entails commitments and obligations on both sides. Now the best kind of human example of this is marriage. It's a covenant where there's promises made and there are a commitment and there are obligations on both sides. But most marriage covenants that I'm aware of don't involve cutting animals in half and walking in between them. And that is what happens here. A heifer, which is a young female cow, a goat, a ram, they all get cut in two. Now the birds don't get cut in half, and people sort of read this and go, what about the birds? Why do we need the birds out? Presumably, I think, because they're too small to do that kind of cutting. But so they get put out as well. And Abraham follows God's instructions precisely. Now maybe, I don't know, it makes me think of a sort of Damien Hirst art installation. Do you know that kind of thing where these animals get cut down the middle? But actually, it's not like this is how you did covenants in those days. And generally, the point was that the dominant king, generally in a covenant, you've got a sort of more dominant figure and a less dominant one. And the more dominant one takes control. And the more dominant one tells the lesser one to get the animals in place. And then the lesser king would be told to walk through the animal parts. Now, what's the point of that? Well, the point is that the more dominant one, the stronger one, is saying to the weaker one, you keep your end of the deal, mate, or look what will happen to you. Do you see? And actually there's an example of this at the end of Jeremiah 34 you can look at another time if you want. That is what he's saying. And if the animals then stand for Abraham's people, the birds of prey coming down on them in verse 11 presumably implies some kind of ominous threat to the people which is chased away. And that is then borne out as we press pause while Abraham falls asleep and God speaks to him again. And here comes the promise part. There's going to be some slavery in Egypt and there's going to be a rescue. Life is going to get difficult, but then it's going to get better. And the ending is good. And then verse 17, back to the animals. What we would expect now, you see, having had these promises made and having had these the animals cut in half, remember the expectation is Abraham is going to have to walk between the pieces. And what's going to happen is God is going to say, well, I'm going to give you this land. I've made these extraordinary promises about things which are going to happen. But in return, Abraham, you and your descendants, you jolly well need to smarten up your act and you need to live an obedient life or else look what will happen to you. Look at all these animal parts. That's going to happen to you if you don't keep your end of the deal. But have a look. Is that what happens? No, it's not what happens. A smoking brazier, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, it says in the ESV, verse 17, they appear and they pass between the pieces. Now what is this? What's going on here? Well, okay, the first readers of Genesis are Israelites. They're reading this from the vantage point of being just on the point of entering the promised land. So end of Deuteronomy. Moses essentially puts these books together, and so the first readers are reading this. So what does an Israelite about to enter the promised land, what do they think of when they think of smoke and light? Well, they know what smoke and light are. You know, they would think of the top of Mount Sinai as Moses received the Ten Commandments, or they'd think of wandering through the desert. Do you remember what are they led by as they wander through the desert later in Exodus? They're led by a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night. So who's this then? What's going on here? Why isn't Abraham walking through the animal parts? Well, because God is walking through the animal parts. Do you see? So do you see how significant this is? You see, this is not how covenants work. The guy with the power and the authority never walks through the animal parts. It's not on him to keep the deal, but no, that's exactly what God does. So what is he saying? He's saying, I will take the consequences of your covenant-breaking sin on myself. When you sin, when you break this covenant, all this mess and destruction and judgment that you see here symbolized in the animal parts, that's going to fall on me. I will die, God is saying. Now, how can God die? That's ridiculous. Well, only if God becomes a man. The offspring of Abraham. Jesus, fully God and fully perfect man. In the end, that is what it takes for God to keep this covenant, to keep these promises. He takes the consequences of our covenant-breaking sin on himself. So how then can it be right? How can it be just? How can it be fair for God to say we are right when we're wrong? Only because he takes the consequences of us being wrong on himself at the cross. That is the price of him keeping his promises. But it's a price he was willing to pay, and it's a price that has now been paid in full. So when we talk about the unconditional love of God, this is what we mean. Not that we are lovely, not that we are lovable in and of ourselves, no, because we're broken, we're fallen, and we know that there's so many times when we fall short of God's standards for us. And when we sin, and we hurt God and we hurt one another, but he loves us nevertheless. And how can we know that he will continue to love us in that way no matter what? How can we know that no matter how much we mess up and we struggle to trust and we act selfishly and we fail to speak up for Jesus and we fail to care for the lost and all those things that become more obvious to us as we go through our Christian life in some ways often, how can we know? Well, because of this covenant. This is how we know God's love for us today will continue tomorrow, not because of anything in us, but because he made a solemn promise to Abraham and then he walked between the animal parts. And then he fulfilled that promise by becoming a man, a faithful, obedient, perfect descendant of Abraham who went to the cross and took the consequences of his people's sin on himself. Now we call that we call this covenant the covenant of grace, because our salvation that is promised in this covenant is entirely free, of no cost to us, and yet it costs God his Son. So if we're trusting in Jesus today, this is our story. We are children of Abraham. We are included in this same covenant. In the face of our fearful weakness, where we doubt, can this really be right? Can I really trust God for this? Does he really love me enough to keep me when I'm messing up? In the face of our covenant-breaking sin, we need only believe his promises, and he says, Jesus' righteousness is credited to you. We need only cast ourselves on the grace of Abraham's covenant offspring, Jesus, and we will find intimacy with him that we were created for. So again, if you've not yet put your trust in Jesus like Abraham trusted God, what is stopping you from doing so? Look at the stars, God said to Abraham. I made those millions of stars. I have the power to keep my promises. You can trust me. And look at the cross in the face of our brokenness, in the face of our sin. God's response isn't to wait for us to sort our acts out, to get ourselves together, to prove we're good enough to deserve his love. He takes the consequences on himself as God becomes a man and dies for sinners, so that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have eternal life. And then that means that today, when suffering comes, when hard times come, when we're faced with the reality of our own sin, we can trust that he is going to take us through those times into eternity with him. We can know there is a God we can trust with the big things, with the small things, with the tough decisions, the times when it's costly to go his way, and we can go to him in those times. What is our instinct when those tough times come? Is it to batten down the hatches? Is it to withdraw from God and his people? So often what happens, isn't it? We think, oh no, life's getting really tough. I need to stop going to church until everything's sorted. No, don't do that, because this is a God who is a God of grace, who's going to take us through this, who's going to get us there. This is the time to turn to him in prayer, to plead with him to act as he's promised to act in his covenant. Let's keep encouraging each other to do that this weekend. Let me lead us in prayer now. Father, we praise you that you first promise these extraordinary promises to save the world, to save us. We don't deserve this. We only naturally turn our backs on you. But you have made these promises that began with Abraham, but then not just made them, but then shown and demonstrated that you are committed to keeping them. Thank you that we can trust you as our creator. When you say things will happen, we can trust they will happen, because you are the God who makes stuff happen. And we praise you too, that you've not left it up to us to keep our end of the deal, but you came in your Son, and he went to the cross, and he died, and he took the consequences of us breaking this covenant so that we might remain in relationship with you. We praise you for your love that sent him to the cross, and we praise you for that love that we can continue to enjoy for eternity. We praise you in Jesus' name. Amen.